The Founding Fathers left behind a complicated legacy. While no American can deny the impacts they had on the foundation of the nation, several actions of theirs, by the standards of the modern day, would be considered questionable at best and reprehensible at worst. The Founders are those who countless Americans thank today for their freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly. However, these are the same Founders who let the issue of slavery go unresolved, implicitly endorsing the brutalization and dehumanization of an entire race, and setting the United States up for a division that would lead to the nation's bloodiest conflict, the Civil War. It is important to understand both the good and the bad of the Founding Fathers' records in order to understand the best way to remember them. The Founding Fathers' greatest accomplishment was drafting the Constitution, and more specifically, the Bill of Rights, the document's first 10 amendments that enshrined into law what are considered in the modern day to be among the most sacred of American civil liberties. These include the freedoms of speech and religion, the freedom to peaceably assemble, and protection from unreasonable search and seizure and cruel and unusual punishment. The protection of these freedoms and rights can be attributed to the Federalists, who refused to vote to ratify the Constitution without the inclusion of the Bill of Rights. In addition, George Washington, the most well-known of the Founding Fathers, had the foresight to warn the American public of the dangers of political parties, as he states regarding parties in his 1797 farewell address, quote, "They serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and, according to the alternate triumphs of different political parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests." End quote. This quote, as well as others in his address, highlights Washington's belief that political parties are meant to divide the American people against one another, to support one party or another, and to forsake trying to find issues of agreement with each other. Given the accomplishments of the Founding Fathers, specifically them being behind several of the civil liberties that Americans today take for granted, it is quite the contradiction that some of them, in positions of power, sought to undermine their values and liberties that they advocated for when drafting the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. One of the most prominent examples of this is John Adams and his passing of the Alien and Sedition Acts. A series of four laws passed during the French Revolution. The first three were passed largely with the intent of discriminating against French immigrants living in America. However, it is the fourth and final law, commonly known as the Sedition Act, that has defined the presidency of Adams ever since. Despite the insistence of Adams and his Federalist Party that the purpose of the act was to suppress the voices of French Revolution supporters, the law targeted Americans who published, quote, "false, scandalous, and malicious writing regarding the government, which inevitably would lead to the silencing of the Federalist rival party, the Democratic Republicans." After the arrests of 25 people for breaking the act, as well as the law's unpopularity, ultimately leading to the downfall of the Federalist Party, the Alien and Sedition Acts, quote, "were either repealed or left to expire after the election of 1800. As well as the Alien and Sedition Acts, the greatest stain on the legacy of the Founding Fathers is their implicit support for slavery. While several founders, mostly Northerners, were against the practice, their opinions on the issue were outweighed by the Southern founders who owned slaves and deliberately refused to address the issue in the Constitution. Even more infuriating, when in power, these slave-owning founders would rail against slavery in a blatant display of hypocrisy. The most egregious example of this is Thomas Jefferson, who expressed his supposed opposition to slavery in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia. Quote, There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for a man is an imitative animal." End quote. Despite his words from this section of his book, as well as his outlawing of the Atlantic slave trade as president, Jefferson owned hundreds of slaves throughout his lifetime, putting on display his hypocrisy on the issue and, along with many of his fellow founding fathers, tainting his legacy and what he is remembered for. Overall, the founders' refusal to even address the issue of slavery would divide the nation in two and lead to the Civil War decades down the road. While the Founding Fathers' accomplishments in the field of civil liberties has left a positive impact on the United States for generations, it is irresponsible to ignore their flaws, which set the nation back several years with the decisions that these actions, or, in the case of slavery, lack thereof, resulted in. The way the Founding Fathers should be remembered is by being aware of both the good and the bad and allowing the learners to come to their own conclusions regarding them. The Founding Fathers' legacy is a nuanced one, and to allow for Americans to remember them in the ways that they see to be the most honest, it must be taught as such.